I've always been a bit of a bookworm. Libraries were my sanctuary, especially during my college days when I needed a quiet space to study. There was one particular library that I loved, tucked away on the edge of campus. It wasn't the biggest or the most modern, but it had this charm. Tall wooden shelves, old leather chairs, and the kind of stillness that made you feel like you could lose yourself in the pages of a book for hours. I spent many nights there, cramming for exams, reading for pleasure, or just escaping the chaos of my dorm. The library was open late, and I'd often be one of the last people to leave. I enjoyed the peace and solitude, until one night when that solitude turned into something far more unsettling. It was during finals week, and I was completely buried in textbooks. The library was almost empty as usual, with only a few other students scattered among the rows of desks. It was nearing midnight, and I was sitting in the far back corner, in the history section. That part of the library was always a little darker than the rest, the lights dimmer, the shelves taller and more imposing. I was deep into my notes when I heard it, the faint sound of pages turning. I looked up, expecting to see someone nearby, but the aisle was empty. I listened carefully, but the sound stopped. Shrugging it off, I went back to my work. But a few minutes later, the sound returned, soft, methodical, the unmistakable rustle of pages turning one by one. This time, I got up and walked toward the sound, glancing around the shelves. Still, no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The library was silent except for the occasional clatter of a distant keyboard. Yet I could feel something out of place. I went back to my desk, but the unease lingered. As I sat down, I realized the lights in my section had dimmed even further. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the corners of the room darker than they had been just moments ago. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my study materials, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance up from my books, scanning the shelves, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, until I noticed the book. A thick, dusty old volume was sticking out from one of the shelves, about halfway down the aisle. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. It was too large, too noticeable. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to inspect it. As I reached for the book, the lights flickered. My hand froze just inches from the spine. The flickering continued, and then, in the brief moments of darkness, I saw it, the outline of a figure at the end of the aisle. Tall, shadowy, and completely still. My heart raced. I blinked, and when the lights steadied again, the figure was gone. I grabbed the book, more out of reflex than anything, and hurried back to my desk. The title was old and worn, the letters barely visible. As I flipped through the pages, they felt strange beneath my fingers. Thin, brittle, and yellowed with age. The text inside was handwritten, in a script I couldn't read. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And then, as I turned another page, a gust of cold air swept through the library. It shouldn't have been possible. There were no windows open, no vents nearby. But the temperature dropped sharply, and with it, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, barely audible. But they grew louder, swirling around me, like voices from all directions, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Insistent, anxious, angry. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the book shut. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in their place. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound echoing through the empty library. I needed to leave. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit, but the path seemed longer than it had before. The rows of shelves stretched endlessly in front of me, and the lights overhead flickered sporadically. My footsteps sounded too loud in the quiet, and with every step, I felt that same presence behind me, the one I had seen earlier in the aisle. I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the entrance. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The library behind me was quiet, normal, just as it had always been. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. I wasn't alone in there. Something else had been watching, whispering, waiting. I never went back to that library again. To this day, I don't know what was in that book or who or what had been turning the pages. But I'm certain of one thing. That library holds secrets far darker than any of the books on its shelves. I used to work part-time at the university library during my final year of college. It wasn't glamorous, but it was an easy gig. The late-night shifts were quiet, and I liked having the place mostly to myself after hours. I'd shelve books, organize materials, and occasionally help the few night owls that wandered in. It was a massive building, 3 floors of bookshelves, study areas, and archives. Most of the time, I worked alone in the basement level where they stored the older, less-used collections. There was something comforting about the musty smell of old books, the faint hum of the air conditioning, and the creak of the wooden shelves as I worked. But there was one part of the basement that no one liked to talk about. The farthest corner, where the rare books and restricted materials were kept. It was roped off, with a sign warning students to stay out unless they had permission. I never gave it much thought. It wasn't part of my job, and I had no reason to go near it. Until one night when I found out why no one wanted to be in that section alone. It was just past midnight when it happened. I was in the middle of reshelving a cart of old reference books when the lights flickered. I'd been through a few power outages before, so I didn't think much of it. I figured the generator would kick in any second. But this time, the lights didn't go out completely. They dimmed to a low, almost suffocating glow. I was in one of the side aisles, surrounded by towering shelves of dusty books, and suddenly everything seemed much darker, much quieter than it had just a moment before. That's when I felt it. A shift in the air, like something had entered the room. I looked around, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but the basement was silent. The air felt heavy, pressing in on me. I brushed it off as nerves, telling myself it was just late and I was tired. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. As I continued shelving books, I began to hear soft footsteps echoing through the aisles. They weren't loud. More like the subtle, careful steps of someone trying to avoid being heard. My pulse quickened as I listened, trying to figure out where they were coming from. The strange thing was, the steps didn't sound like they were coming from the same aisle. One moment they were behind me, the next to my left, then in front of me, as if whoever or whatever was moving through the stacks was circling me. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. Just the quiet hum of the building and those unnerving footsteps growing closer, circling faster. My throat tightened as I felt that presence again, stronger this time, like a weight pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe one of the other workers had come down to the basement without me noticing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it. Something wasn't right. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the air grew deathly still. I turned, my eyes scanning the shelves, and that's when I noticed it. The restricted section, the roped-off corner in the far end of the basement, was no longer blocked off. The rope that usually hung across the entrance was lying on the floor, and the old wooden door to the rare books collection was slightly ajar. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. That door had always been locked. Always. No one ever went in there except the head librarian, and even she seemed uncomfortable with it. But now it was open, and something was telling me to go inside. My heart raced as I stepped toward the door, my feet moving on their own. I didn't want to go in, but something was pulling me toward it, compelling me to cross the threshold. As I reached the doorway, I hesitated. A cold draft wafted out from the room, carrying with it the faint scent of dampness and something else, something rotten. I peered inside, and the first thing I noticed was the darkness. It was as if the lights from the basement couldn't penetrate the room. It was pitch black, except for a faint glow emanating from the farthest corner. I stepped inside. The air was colder in the room, and the glow was coming from an old, weathered book lying on a pedestal. The pages seemed to shimmer faintly, casting the only light in the otherwise dark space. My curiosity overpowered my fear, and I approached the book, drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. Just as I reached out to touch it, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, heavy breathing. It was coming from right behind me. I froze, my hand hovering just above the book. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it. Something was standing right behind me, breathing softly, watching me. My entire body trembled as the breathing grew louder, more ragged, like whatever was behind me was struggling to contain itself. I could feel its presence looming over me, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. Then, in the reflection of the book's glass case, I saw it, a dark, human-shaped figure standing inches from me. Its features were indistinct, a swirling mass of shadow and mist, but its eyes were bright and watching. I screamed and bolted from the room, not caring if the door slammed behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the exit of the basement. The lights above me flickered back to full brightness as I burst into the stairwell, panting, my heart racing. I never went back to that section of the library again. No one mentioned the door being open, and when I told my supervisor about it, she brushed it off as if it had never happened. But I knew better. Something was down there in the restricted section, and whatever it was, it had seen me. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the experience. I avoided working in the basement and stuck to the main floors, but I still felt uneasy. Every time I passed the stairwell that led down to the basement, I felt a cold chill. It was as if the air around that place was different, heavier, darker. It didn't take long for the nightmares to start. In them, I was back in the library, alone in the basement. The same dim light, the same oppressive silence. But in the dream, the door to the restricted section wasn't just ajar. It was wide open, with darkness spilling out like ink. I could hear the breathing again, slow and deliberate, echoing in the stillness. And every time, just before I woke up, I would see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me. Its glowing eyes would lock onto mine, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. But the real terror began when I started hearing the breathing outside the dream. One night, after a particularly exhausting shift, I was heading home when I felt it. A faint sense of unease, the same feeling I had in the library basement. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just paranoia. But as I lay in bed that night, just on the edge of sleep, I heard it again. The breathing. At first, it was soft, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was standing just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen, barely daring to breathe myself. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was so real, so tangible. I mustered the courage to sit up and look toward the door. It was shut, just as I had left it, but the air in the room felt colder, thicker. And then I saw it. A shadow just like the one from the library, standing in the corner of my room. I couldn't move. The figure stood there, its shape barely discernible, just a mass of dark mist and those same glowing eyes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, except for the steady, labored breathing. I don't know how long I stared at it, but eventually, it faded, dissolving into the shadows of the room. The air warmed again, and the breathing stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I called in sick and went straight to my supervisor. I didn't tell her everything, just that I couldn't work in the basement anymore. She seemed to understand, giving me a knowing look before assigning me to a different section of the library. Since then, I've avoided that place. I quit the job soon after, and I've never stepped foot in that library again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the soft, ragged breathing, just on the edge of my hearing. I've moved far from that university, but the memories linger, and I'm left wondering if that shadow still watches me, waiting for the right moment to step out of the darkness again. Working in a library might not sound exciting, but for someone like me, it was a dream job. Ever since I was a kid, I'd been obsessed with books. The older, the better. So when I landed a job at a historic library known for its vast collection of ancient texts, I couldn't have been more thrilled. The building was massive, with 3 floors filled with every kind of book imaginable. I was responsible for organizing and preserving the rare and fragile ones. The basement, though, was a different story. While the upper floors were well lit and welcoming, the basement was dark, damp, and filled with old tomes that hadn't been touched in decades, maybe centuries. Some of the books were so old they were falling apart, and the entire section had a smell, a mix of mildew and forgotten history. I loved the peace and quiet down there. It was like stepping back in time. But as much as I enjoyed being surrounded by ancient knowledge, there was one part of the basement that made me uneasy: the back room. It was locked most of the time and no one really talked about it. I assumed it housed some of the more valuable books, ones they didn't want anyone getting their hands on. It wasn't until one night, when I found myself alone down there, that I discovered the truth about what was really locked away in that room. It was a rainy Friday evening. The library was almost empty, and I was finishing up my last task of the night, reshelving some old reference books in the basement. I was about to head upstairs when I noticed the door to the back room was slightly ajar. That door was always locked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself drawn to it, as if something was calling me inside. I pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped room filled with dusty shelves. In the center was a single pedestal with a book on it, as if it had been left there for a reason. The book was massive, bound in thick, dark leather. There was no title, no markings. It looked ancient. Something about it felt off, like it shouldn't have been there. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. Against my better judgment, I approached the pedestal. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange sense of dread creeping over me. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings. Nothing I'd ever seen before. They were intricate and bizarre, spiraling across the paper like some kind of forgotten language. As I flipped through the pages, the room seemed to grow darker, as if the very act of looking at the book was draining the light from the air. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, like multiple voices speaking at once, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. It felt like they were coming from the walls, the floor, the book itself. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the whispering stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. I slammed the book shut and stepped back, my hands shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the old building was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the symbols from the book, twisting and turning in my mind. And then the whispering started again. First, it was soft, like it had been in the library. But as the nights passed, it grew louder, more insistent. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of voices echoing in my head, though there was no one else in the room. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open, though I was certain I had locked it. A chill filled the room, and I could feel someone, watching me from the darkness outside. I slammed the window shut and drew the curtains, but the feeling of being watched never left. Things escalated from there. Books would fall off the shelves in the library when I walked past, landing open on pages filled with strange markings. The basement, once my sanctuary, now felt hostile. Every time I stepped into it, I felt like I was being followed, like there were eyes on me from the shadows. One evening, as I was locking up, I saw it, a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, standing at the far end of the basement, just out of the light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. My heart raced as I slowly backed away, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I reached the stairs, the figure shifted, taking a step forward. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted up the stairs and didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. When I looked back through the basement windows, the figure was gone. I quit the job soon after that. I couldn't take it anymore. The nightmares, the whispers, the constant feeling of being watched. But even after I left, it followed me. The whispering didn't stop. The sense of dread lingered. One night, As I lay in bed, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of pages turning. I opened my eyes, and there it was, the same book from the library, lying open on my desk, though I had never brought it home. The air in the room grew cold, and the voices, those damned voices, filled the room, louder than ever. But this time there was something different. One voice stood out, clearer than the rest, spoke a single word, one I didn't understand but knew deep down meant something terrible. I stared at the book, unable to move, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell silent, and the book slammed shut on its own. That was the last time I saw it. I don't know what I awakened that night in the library, but whatever it was, it let me go, for now. But every once in a while, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint sound of pages turning. And I know that one day it'll come back.